his inauguration concerning Panama, Canada, Mexico, the Gulf of Mexico, and even Gaza are important in the sense that they show his mindset and approach. They fit right within this might makes right transactional power politics framework. Yes, sorry, Atul.
Best example is the latest AI generated video that he has released on Instagram, wherein the death and desolation in Gaza will be replaced by people eating on the beaches, Elon Musk, of course, and women doing belly dancing, and one particular belle dancing with Donald Trump himself. And you'll have a golden statue of his, and you'll have Trump Gaza, prime property on the Riviera on the Mediterranean, and life will be good. So maybe he will achieve what General Allenby couldn't, which is everlasting peace in the Holy Land.
What's been notable but not surprising to me, or significant in that sort of crazy thing, is it's not from Trump, but it's about him. And since it's flattering to him, he thinks that's why he has embraced it and given it world notice. Is are rather the comments that I've seen in reaction to that video. And those reactions explain why Trump is sitting in the Oval Office. And perhaps the far right or the isolationist population writes more comments than those who disagree with that. But on the whole, the people have said, as I've seen, other than the outrage from the likes of me, I haven't been outraged at that. I thought that was sort of silly. But the reactions have been, oh, well, look, this is really clearly, if people would listen to Trump, this is the world as it should be, where things can be developed, and these pesky third world types really have no say except as backdrops, as belly dancers. It's distressing, but if I'm afraid there's a lot of support for that worldview, which doesn't mean that Gaza is going to turn into a casino anytime soon. So, what will happen to Ukraine? It's looking as though Ukraine will exist as an independent state for now. But we mustn't pay too much attention to Russia's conventional military, which has been stretched to the limits. And were the war to continue for a year, Russia would be having, most experts assess substantially greater difficulty to maintain the war, its economy, and even Russia's stability. But Trump is giving Putin a way out. But more important than Russia's military, really, is Russia is quite smart. And intelligence operations have dramatically changed the perspective of many Americans in the United States. And the Russian intelligence services, continue to act to shape political opinion, destabilize political systems to their own ends. They attempted a couple of times to assassinate the prime minister of Montenegro. They were foiled by the CIA and I think other Western intelligence services because they tried to assassinate him because of his Western turn, his pro-NATO, pro-EU, pro-Western normative system turn. They've done this multiple times prior to trying to kill Zelensky in Ukraine, which is the reason there was I think it was Orange Revolution in 2004, and the Maidan uprising in 2014 or 13. And they will continue. And it's espionage is low cost business compared to militaries. And the the gains are often less total, but shifting the trajectory of an opponent is as fundamental as conquering. You don't want to conquer a country that doesn't want to be conquered. You want to shape it so that it does what you want to do. This is right out of Sun Tzu from 2000, I think 300 years ago. The best battle is one that's not fought. You induce your opponent to do what you want him to do, and that's your victory. And so the Russians will continue to do this, and they are succeeding quite dramatically with regard to Ukraine. What will come out of it for the U.S.? Well, Trump is transactional, so we're now extorting Ukraine for its mineral wealth in the characteristically stupid grasp of Trump. He talks about rare earth. They have rare earths, I guess. And of course, he's referring to the rare minerals, some of which are vital for high technology products, batteries, and integrated circuits, and so on. And beyond that, Trump doesn't really care about anything. It also probably means that we can't quite yet say that NATO has been destroyed, but it seems clear that Donald Trump will not honor. He's been almost explicit about this through J.D. Vance and his own statements. The Article 5, which is the obligation of the NATO treaty, which is the critical one, which is that an attack on one is an attack on all, and that one will come to the defense militarily of a member state. And Trump has said, no, if you guys don't take care of yourselves, then I'm not going to spend 5 cents or one breath on you. And the German, we'll talk about this in a moment, the new soon-to-be German chancellor has been quite clear-eyed about this, and I think necessarily praise him for speaking so directly. He said, it's quite clear that Trump has left us on our own, and the actions of the United States in Germany are as hostile to German interests as those of Russia, which is quite a shocking but accurate characterization of what has happened under Trump as president. So we see both the ghost of Munich in 1938 and the ghost of J.D. Vance and Donald Trump in Munich in 2025. Yeah.
Very quickly, why we said this is whole body problem, the three-body problem, is because there's, of course, the US under Donald Trump, which says Europeans are out on their own. It's not just 2%. Now you should spend 5% on your defense. So Europe, of course, suffers the squeeze. Europe, which in many ways was reluctantly dragged into war by a Biden administration, is now committed to war. And it's now the US which has said, okay, let's have peace behind European backs. The negotiations are occurring in Saudi Arabia, or have occurred in Saudi Arabia, which has upset Europeans enormously, particularly the French, and of course the British. Although everyone is still visiting the US, Emmanuel Macron was in Washington and tried to put on a brave face and even contradicted Donald Trump at some point. But the reality is that Europe will be left with increased costs of its own defense, as well as costs of reconstruction of of Ukraine. So defense plus Ukraine, that means its bill gets higher. At the same time, its income is most likely to go down because of tariffs in the US. So Europe will go through a double whammy. Ukraine, of course, is the sacrificial lamb in the altar. In some ways, it was always going to be, because it served a purpose both for Russia, a pure land grab, as well as for the US in terms of geopolitical containing of Russia and its preserving its rules-based order. And so Ukraine was always running out of men and was faring poorly, and its economy had imploded. But now Ukraine is really going to sign away all sorts of stuff, not just to the Russians but also to the Americans. There's supposedly a deal now with the US. Who knows what details it has? And Russia, of course, is now back with its spheres of influence, realpolitik policy vindicated in its invasion, and most likely it'll offer softs to Donald Trump and the US and be back in the global financial system. So we are going to see this curious interplay of four parties, and all of these four parties are very fractured in Europe. Remember, Viktor Orban is not exactly in favor of a particularly aggressive stance against Russia. He wants Russian gas. Remember, Slovakia, Robert Fico, again, is more akin to Viktor Orban. Poland, with its memory of both Russian and German transgression, would probably go nuclear on its own, because Poland certainly doesn't want Russian tanks rolling through Polish territory. It remembers the Katyn massacre, wherein 10,000 Polish officers and artists and doctors and intellectuals, basically the flower of Polish society, was just shot with a bullet in the back of their head, and the whole thing was blamed on the Nazis. The Poles have not forgotten that, and the Poles know they cannot rely on Germany, really. And Europe, for all its protestations that yes, we can create a new defense force, and we'll get to this in a second or in a minute when we discuss Germany, or in a few minutes when we discuss Germany, is far too fractured internally. Europe has no cohesion, France included. France doesn't, and Germany could not pass a budget last year. So really, at the moment, as we see it, this four-body problem has no solution. And at the end of the day, the post-war order, as we know it, is dead. Even if Donald Trump were to die today, even if, let's say, there was someone like Dwight D. Eisenhower take over, emerge miraculously from the Republican Party, and that's not J.D. Vance, by the way, even if that happened, the rest of the world will not have faith in the US, because they have seen the pendulum swing crazily. And the word of the US is not as good as it was anymore. The word of a US president is not the nation's bond.
Yeah, everyone almost can break Humpty Dumpty, but no one's ever been able to put him back together very successfully. That's the dilemma. I would differ with one thing at least, with what you said, but otherwise I agree on the whole. I don't think Europe was brought in against its will. It was everyone was horrified by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, most everyone except for Donald Trump. But to your other point, I completely agree with, because Europe can't organize itself without U.S. leadership. They would have floundered to respond. With the U.S. leadership, as has been the case since 1945, they could coherently respond by being part of a Europe influenced but fundamentally U.S. policy. But that gets to the other point you made, which I think is really important. I have two more things to say on this broad subject, and then we move on to Deutschland. And it is, what is Europe to do left on its own? The reason NATO was created, in the words of a wag from 80 years ago, was to keep the U.S. in, Russia out, and Germany down. And it succeeded. But now the U.S. is going out, Russia is in, and Germany has probably will be unable to stand up. But a point I made to German colleagues 25 years ago was, which frightened them, because they had the standard perspective of post-war Germany, which was, we know what we did, and we're horrified. Don't give us the leadership in anything, because no one will trust us and everyone will hate us. I said, if Germany does not lead Europe, Europe will not be led. That remains largely true. A German-French consortium, or whatever you want to call it, a duopoly, can probably do it, but they've never succeeded. So this is the great dilemma now. There are exponentially larger challenges for Europe, given how Trump is walking away, and as we see in the Ukraine issue. How does a NATO, say, with 32 members, or 31 if you take the U.S. de facto out, really, where each nation has a veto, coordinate policy, or who leads that? And the EU, with 27 members, has the same dilemma. And each of them has its own national interests and military establishments and priorities. This is why the bilateral approach of transactional deals that is so dear and defining of Beijing, or Xi Jinping in China, and of Donald Trump, is possibly good for the U.S. and China on a case-by-case basis, but is really sort of fool's gold, ultimately, for other nations. And I would argue even for India, although that's a gratuitous swipe at India, since we're talking about India right now, because a bilateral deal will always be imbalanced between the superpower and the other. And so country X may benefit on a specific product or service, but has less recourse and less leverage than in a more multilaterally defined whole system. So Europe is in a big bind on this issue, how to organize itself and respond. And I think there will be increases in defense budgets, and there will be steps to attempt to coordinate military policy. But anyone who's been in Europe has heard this as a desire and a need for 80 years. And the fundamentals have not changed. They have literally not changed. The GNP per capita, GNP by country as percentage of global GNP, almost none of this has changed. And then the last thing is, what are the global effects? We've just talked about Europe and Ukraine and the US and Russia. The global effects are dramatic. Taiwan probably now needs some depends, because they are so concerned about it, depends as in so as to remain continent or not have unfortunate effects, because Trump has made clear that he's not going to intercede in another country's disputes, and he'd rather make a deal to sell American wheat to Beijing than to send the Seventh Fleet to the Taiwan Straits. And then the global South, which has been both victim and free rider in all of these recent things, meaning the consequences of the invasion of Ukraine specifically, can profit from bilateral deals, but ultimately the great powers get what they want from the weaker global South members. And the global South will have no recourse but to cut a deal on the terms that ultimately the great powers respectively want. There's no recourse, as there was with the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, and the multilateral agreements. And so we really are seeing a 21st century version of return, frankly, I think, to de facto gunboat diplomacy, with bilateral deals of the strong imposed on the weak progressively happening. So for investors, just to conclude, what does one do with all of this, aside from duck, going to buy gold, the traditional refuge of instability, or invest in domestic producers in one's home country or in the U.S., given the increasing protectionism that's a component of all of these changes coming out of Ukraine and Trump's re-election.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.